The storm over Sydney raged like a warning from the heavens, lightning cracking over the harbour, as if trying to illuminate the sins hiding behind the glass walls of the Blackwater mansion. But inside the marble kitchen, under the soft hum of the refrigerator, Mia Santos quietly scrubbed blood off the floor that wasn't hers, choking back the pain shooting up her right arm every time she moved, because the bone was fractured, swollen, discolored, and she was doing everything in her power to hide. It from the man who ruled this house with an iron fist and a reputation carved from fear. Adrian Blackwater, Australia's most feared underworld boss, polished, calculated, untouchable, didn't tolerate weakness from anyone, especially not from the people under his roof. And tonight, Mia couldn't afford to be seen as weak. She scrubbed harder, biting her lip so she wouldn't wince, her vision blurring as the pain flared white-hot. Her arm throbbed, her breathing trembled, but she kept going. She had cleaned this kitchen 1,000 times, usually invisible, always silent, always careful. No one looked at the maid. No one questioned the bruised girl blending into the corners. That was how Mia survived. But everything shattered the moment the kitchen lights flicked on behind her. Adrian stood in the doorway, wet hair from the storm, black-tailored coat dripping rainwater onto the polished floor, shoulders broad, presence overwhelming. His eyes, cold, calculating grey, locked onto her instantly. She froze mid-scrub. The room seemed to stop breathing. "Why?" Adrian said quietly, dangerously. "Are you working at 1 in the morning?" Mia bowed her head. "It needed cleaning, sir." His voice sharpened. "Look at me." She turned slowly. His eyes narrowed immediately. Predator focus, unblinking. Mia tried to hide her arm behind her back. Too late. Adrian's gaze dropped to the swelling, the bruising, the unnatural bend beneath her sleeve. His jaw clenched. "Who did that to you?" She swallowed hard. "No one, sir. I just fell." Adrian stepped closer. 1 step. 2. The air thickened. "Don't insult my intelligence," he murmured. "Your arm is broken." Her breath hitched. "I can still work." That wasn't the question. He reached out slowly, and Mia instinctively flinched. Adrian stopped mid-movement, eyes sharpening with something lethal. "But you're afraid?" "No, sir." "Wrong answer." His voice dropped further, a slow burn of fury creeping beneath every syllable. "Who hurt you?" Mia's lips trembled. If she told him the truth, she'd die. If she lied, she'd also die. Adrian took another step until his shoes touched the bucket she had been using. His scent, clean rain and expensive cologne, exposing how close he was, how trapped she was. "Your arm didn't break itself, Mia." She clenched her jaw, refusing to cry. "It doesn't matter." His expression shifted, still cold but sharper, more dangerous. "It matters to me." Her heart stuttered. Adrian Blackwater did not care about maids. Adrian Blackwater did not care about anyone, but he cared enough to ask twice. Mia whispered, "Please, let it go." Silence. Heavy. Electric. Terrifying. Adrian's eyes darkened as if something clicked inside him, like a switch flipping from curiosity to violence. "Who?" he repeated quietly. "Tell me, Mia." She shook her head, tears burning behind her eyes. She couldn't speak, she wouldn't. Adrian reached out again, slowly, deliberately, and this time she didn't flinch. He touched her wrist gently, so gently she almost gasped, lifting her arm just enough to confirm what he already knew. "This was done by a man," he murmured, "a strong one, someone who thinks you belong to him." Mia's breath trembled. He wasn't wrong. Adrian's voice sharpened. "Someone under my roof." Mia blinked rapidly, fear striking through her like lightning. Adrian leaned in, his tone dropping into something so quiet, so lethal, the room seemed to freeze. "You're going to tell me," he whispered, "or I will destroy every man in this house until I find the one who touched you." Her heart stopped. But before she could answer, the power flickered, lights dimming, thunder roaring. The storm was reaching its peak. Adrian straightened. "Go to your room," he ordered. "Now!" Mia hesitated. "Sir." "Go." She obeyed instantly, clutching her arm, stumbling as she rushed down the hallway. Adrian watched her disappear into the shadows, expression unreadable, jaw tight, something ancient and violent simmering beneath the surface. And when the thunder shook the mansion again, Adrian pulled out his phone, dialed a number, and said 5 cold words that would echo across Sydney's underworld by dawn. "Wake the men." "We hunt." And Mia had no idea, none, that tonight, because of her broken arm, 15 men would vanish from Sydney before sunrise. Mia barely made it to the tiny staff bedroom at the far end of the mansion's lower floor, closing the door with her good hand before collapsing onto the narrow bed, pressing her injured arm to her chest as silent tears slipped down her cheeks, because she knew what Adrian calling the men meant, and it terrified her more than the pain, more than the fracture, more than the bruises climbing her skin like shadows. She didn't want anyone to die because of her, not even the monsters who had cornered her in the dark loading bay 2 nights ago when she'd gone to take the rubbish out, thinking the worst thing waiting for her outside was the cold. But instead she found Mark, Adrian's reckless cousin, drunk and furious after being cut off from the family accounts, and he'd grabbed her, shoved her, twisted her arm until she screamed, snapping bone with a sickening crack. Telling her to learn her place, because in his mind she was nothing, just a maid, just a girl with no money, no power, no protection. And Mia remembered the way his friends laughed as she hit the ground, the way he spat near her face before walking away, as if breaking her arm was no more meaningful than stepping on a cockroach. She curled tighter under the thin blanket, shaking, knowing that if Adrian ever discovered Mark was responsible, blood would paint the walls of this house by sunrise. She didn't want violence. She didn't want chaos. She only wanted to survive long enough to save her little brother in Brisbane, the one she'd been secretly sending money to, the one who believed she was working a normal cleaning job in a hotel, not trapped in the house of Australia's most unpredictable crime boss. But upstairs, as she trembled in the dark, Adrian walked down the hallway like a storm in human form, his wet coat dripping onto the Persian rugs, his expression carved from rage and calculation, his mind already in motion. He reached his office, slammed the door behind him, and the moment it clicked shut, he shed the controlled, elegant facade he used for the world and allowed the merciless side of himself to rise. He stood before the glass wall overlooking the lightning-slashed harbour, jaw tight, fists clenched, replaying Mia's flinch in his mind. He had seen fear before. He caused it for a living, but there was something about the way she tried to hide her arm, something about the desperation in her eyes, that awakened a part of him he thought had died years ago when he buried the last person he failed to protect. His phone buzzed. Adrian answered it without looking. "They're gathered," a voice said. "Garage level." Adrian didn't reply. He simply ended the call and headed downstairs. In the underground garage, 12 of his most loyal men stood waiting, hard faces, dark jackets, silent respect filling the concrete space. But the moment Adrian stepped into the room, every head lowered, because even among criminals, Adrian Blackwater was different. He didn't need to shout to command fear. He spoke only 2 words. "No survivors." The men stiffened. They knew what that meant. Someone in the inner circle had broken a woman in Adrian's house, a woman who had done nothing but work quietly, obey the rules, fade into the walls, and that crime, in Adrian's world, was unforgivable. "Boss," one man said cautiously, "there are at least 20 men on the estate tonight. You want all of them?" 15, Adrian interrupted. "Only 15 of them were here when she disappeared for an hour 2 nights ago. Find those 15. Bring them to me." His eyes hardened further. Alive. He wanted answers. And then, justice. He turned to leave, but paused. Search for signs of a struggle, blood, clothing fibers, anything. The men nodded and scattered immediately. Adrian stood alone for a moment, listening to the storm hammering the metal doors of the garage, remembering the way Mia's voice trembled as she said it didn't matter. It mattered to him in a way he wasn't prepared to admit. He headed back upstairs and walked through the silent corridors until he reached her room. He didn't knock. He opened the door. Mia gasped, sitting up instantly, blanket clutched to her chest, eyes wide and terrified like a cornered animal. "Don't be afraid," Adrian said, softer than he intended. Lightning flashed behind him, outlining his silhouette like a dark avenger. Mia whispered, "I don't want trouble." "Trouble found you anyway." She swallowed. "Please don't hurt anyone." Adrian stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Someone broke your arm." "It was an accident." "It wasn't." His voice sharpened, lethal under the softness. "He grabbed you, twisted, applied enough force to snap the humerus. That wasn't an accident." Mia's breath caught. He knew too much. How can you tell?" He kneeled beside her bed, Adrian Blackwater, the man the entire Sydney underworld feared, kneeling, and gently pulled her arm toward him again. She whimpered at the pressure, but he held it steady, analyzing the angle. "Because I've broken bones," he murmured, "and I know exactly how it feels when it happens." Mia looked away, tears spilling silently. "Don't cry," he said, not unkindly, not cold, conflicted. "Not because of him," she whispered. "Please, Adrian, don't kill anyone." His eyes lifted to meet hers, and for a moment, just a moment, she saw something behind the monster everyone in Australia whispered about. Something human. Something wounded. Something she didn't understand. "I won't kill them," he said. Relief swept across her face. "Thank you." "I said I wouldn't kill them," Adrian clarified, voice deepening. "I didn't say they would live comfortably afterward." Her heart stopped. Lightning cracked outside, thunder shook the building. And all Mia could think was, in the morning the Sydney would be different. The storm raged harder through the night as Mia sat frozen on the edge of her narrow bed, staring at Adrian as he rose to his full height, shadows carving sharp lines across his face, the kind of face that belonged to a man who had buried too many sins to ever be ordinary again. And she whispered, "Adrian, please don't do this." But he didn't reply, didn't soften, only stepped closer until she could feel the quiet pressure of hi. Sam's presence filling the tiny room, making it hard to breathe as he gently lifted her chin with one finger, eyes scanning every bruise she had tried so desperately to hide, and he murmured, "Mia, whoever did this to you hurt something that belongs to my house, and no one walks away from that," sending a shiver of fear through her spine, because she suddenly understood Adrian was not angry. He was controlled, calculating, terrifyingly calm, which meant his vengeance would be surgical and irreversible. He studied her for another long moment, before finally saying, "Sleep if you can, I won't let anyone near you." Then he turned and walked out, closing the door with a softness that didn't match the violence vibrating through the mansion, leaving Mia trembling in the dark as she stared at the shadow under the door, wondering who exactly she was living with because she had known he was dangerous. But she hadn't known he was this, the kind of man whose voice alone could make grown criminals break int. Oh, sweat. Downstairs, Adrian moved like a ghost through the halls, every step echoing with a promise of retribution as he headed to the surveillance room, where two men were already standing stiff with fear beside a wall of monitors. "Play everything from midnight 2 nights ago," Adrian ordered, and the footage appeared, grainy night vision showing the staff corridors, the kitchen loading bay, the exterior bins, and then the moment Mia appeared on screen, walking alone with a rubbish bag, looking small, Thai. Red, unaware that 3 men were lurking near the corner, their faces half hidden by shadows, but Adrian recognized one instantly. Mark. Adrian's jaw flexed so sharply it looked carved from stone as he watched Mark grab her, watched Mia drop the rubbish bag and try to pull away, watched Mark twist her arm until her entire body jolted violently, and she collapsed. And Adrian didn't blink, didn't breathe, didn't say a word, but the temperature in the room dropped like winter had swept inside. "Where is he now?" Adrian asked in a voice so quiet it made both guards flinch. "Still in the East Wing, boss," one of them answered shakily. "He's been drinking all night." Adrian nodded once, a small lethal gesture, then walked out of the room. Upstairs, Mia pressed her good hand to her mouth, trying not to cry again as she heard heavy footsteps echoing through the halls. But this time, they weren't coming toward her. They were heading somewhere else, somewhere far more dangerous. Adrian reached the East Wing, pushed open the door without knocking, and found Mark sprawled across a leather sofa, half drunk, half asleep, surrounded by empty bottles. Mark groaned and rubbed his face, squinting. "Adrian, what the hell are you doing here?" he slurred. Adrian didn't answer. He simply stepped inside, closed the door and locked it. Mark frowned. "Got a problem?" Still nothing. Adrian just walked closer, his silence more terrifying than any shout could ever be. Mark laughed uneasily. "Come on, mate. Don't tell me you're here because of that stupid maid." He didn't finish the sentence. Adrian struck so fast Mark didn't even see the blow coming, his body crashing sideways into the table. Bottles shattering as Adrian pinned him to the ground with a knee to his chest, one hand gripping Mark's throat hard enough to cut off air. And Adrian leaned down, voice low, deadly intimate. "You broke her arm." Mark choked, trying to push him off. She was just a maid." "She works under my roof," Adrian snarled. "She follows my rules, respects my home, and stays invisible to keep the peace. And you, my own blood, decided to harm her." His grip tightened. Mark's eyes bulged. Adrian's voice dropped even lower. "She begged me not to kill you." Mark gagged. So you're going to let me go?" Adrian stared into his eyes. "No." He released his throat, only to slam Mark's head against the floor, knocking him unconscious instantly. Outside the room, Adrian's men appeared silently, standing in formation. "Take him," Adrian ordered, "and find the remaining 14. One man hesitated. "Boss, by morning?" Adrian's expression didn't change. "By sunrise." Mia, still awake in the tiny bedroom downstairs, heard the distant footsteps again, the sound of men being dragged, the sound of consequences unfolding in real time, and she pressed her hand against her heart, whispering into the darkness, "What have I done?" But the answer was simple. She hadn't done anything. Adrian Blackwater had simply chosen whom to protect. Mia barely slept, drifting in and out of restless flashes of memory, every blink carrying her back to Mark's cold hands, crushing her wrist, twisting her arm until her bones screamed, and the sickening snap echoed in her head like a nightmare on repeat. But now there was a different sound beneath it. Boots on marble, doors opening, muffled shouts swallowed quickly by silence, and she realized that whatever Adrian had set in motion, it was happening. Right now throughout the entire Blackwater estate. Before dawn, she heard the heavy thud of a vehicle engine outside, the low rumble vibrating through the floorboards, and her pulse spiked in panic until a soft knock came at her door, not threatening, not aggressive, just a careful, respectful knock no one had ever used with her before, and when she opened it with her good hand, she found Elena, Adrian's head housekeeper, a stern woman in her 50s, who rarely smiled, but who now looked at Mia with a softness that made her throat close. "Come with me," Elena whispered, "and don't ask questions." And Mia, still trembling, followed her through the hallways she usually scrubbed on her hands and knees, hallways now filled with moving shadows, as Adrian's men carried unconscious bodies past them, dragging them like useless sacks toward the back entrance of the estate, and Mia's breaths turned shallow as she recognized one face, then another, 15 men in total, the same group. That used to whistle at her, mock her accent, steal her cleaning supplies, shove her shoulders when she passed, make her life hell when Adrian wasn't around, and she realized none of them would ever hurt her again. Elena guided her through a side corridor and opened a door she had never been allowed to enter, revealing a private infirmary with white walls, bright lights, and medical equipment she hadn't seen since the small clinic back in her hometown, and she whispered, "Why am I here?" But Elena simply gestured to the doctor already waiting beside the bed, a woman in her 30s with sharp eyes and gentle hands, who said, "Mr." Blackwater ordered full treatment for your injuries, making Mia stiffen, because Adrian wasn't a man who ordered anything lightly. As the doctor examined her arm, Mia winced when she touched the fracture, and the doctor muttered, "Clean break, it will heal well," then added softly, "He found out?" Mia nodded wordlessly, cheeks burning with shame, but the doctor didn't judge her, only wrapped her arm carefully, her movements precise, professional, and deeply kind. Halfway through, Mia heard steps, slow, controlled, unmistakably Adrian, and her heart lurched because she wasn't ready to face him, not like this, vulnerable, trembling, still smelling faintly of bleach and fear. But he stepped inside anyway, the room shrinking around him, and his eyes landed straight on her injured arm before lifting to her face with a look she didn't know how to translate. Anger, regret, protectiveness, fury, all swirling under the surface. "Is she stable?" he asked the doctor, his voice quiet but sharp. Enough to slice air, and the doctor nodded, explaining the fracture and aftercare. But Adrian had already stepped closer, lowering his voice until only Mia could hear him as he said, "You should have told me." And she whispered back, "I was scared," avoiding his eyes, but he reached out and lifted her chin gently, forcing her to meet his gaze, and he murmured, "Never be scared of me." The words not a command, but a plea, surprising her so deeply she forgot how to breathe. The doctor stepped aside and Elena left the room, leaving them alone in the sterile silence, and Adrian sat on the stool beside her bed, his hand hovering near hers but not touching it, as if he feared hurting her again through accident or proximity. And he said in a voice stripped of all the steel he used with everyone else, "Mia, what happened to you will not happen again. Not in my house, not in my presence, not on this earth while I'm alive." And she felt tears pool despite her efforts to hold them back, whispering, "I didn't want trouble." But Adrian shook his head slightly, eyes dark with something deeper than anger, something like guilt, something like responsibility, before he whispered, "Trouble comes from men who think they're untouchable, and all of them just learned they're not." And when she glanced toward the hallway where Mark and the others had been dragged, she realized there was no exaggeration in his expression, no threat, no attempt at intimidation. Adrian Blackwater didn't need to threaten. His existence was the threat. Mia lowered her gaze, suddenly overwhelmed by the weight of his protection, his fury, and the strange, unsettling warmth in his voice when he said her name. But before she could respond, a knock sounded again, and one of Adrian's lieutenants entered, face pale as though he'd seen something he couldn't unsee. "It's done," the man said quietly, and Adrian nodded once, a silent signal of acceptance. But Mia shivered, because "it's done" could mean 1,000 things in the Wayo. Adrian ruled, and none of them were gentle. Adrian stood, straightening his jacket, then turned back to her with an intensity that made her heart stumble, and he said, "Rest now," pausing before adding something softer, almost reluctant, "You're safe." And then he walked out, leaving Mia in the bright white room with her pulse racing and her thoughts tangled, wondering what kind of man would punish his enemies with such precision, yet look at her as though she were something fragile he needed to protect with his own life. And she whispered into the quiet, "Why me?" Without knowing, Adrian already had the same question burning in his mind, except his version was far more dangerous. Who hurt her before she came here, and how long had she been hiding it? Mia woke hours later to the soft hum of machines and sunlight, cutting sharp lines across the infirmary wall, her arm securely bandaged, her breathing easier, but her mind louder than ever, as flashes of the night returned in fragmented pie. Says Mark's scream as Adrian's men dragged him. Adrian's voice low and lethal, the doctor telling her she was safe. And for a moment she allowed herself to believe it, until she remembered the truth that always lurked at the edge of her thoughts. Safety never lasted, not for girls like her, not for girls who grew up watching their mothers beg violent men for mercy, not for girls who learned to hide bruises before they learned to read, not for girls who ran from one nightmare only to land straight into the arms of a man whose name alone made criminals flinch. She sat up slowly, wincing at the stab of pain in her ribs, when the door opened quietly and Elena entered with a tray of food, fresh fruit, warm bread, a bowl of soup that smelled like comfort itself. And Mia blinked in confusion, because no one had ever served her anything in this house. No one had ever treated her like someone worth caring for, but Elena set the tray on her lap with surprising gentleness and said, "Eat," her voice soft. Earlier than usual, as though the entire staff had silently agreed that Mia needed protection now, Mia whispered, "Where is everyone?" And Eleanor exhaled, a rare crack in her composed exterior, before replying, "Gone, mister." Blackwater sent them away, a careful phrase Mia recognized instantly as a cover, a polite version of the truth, because Adrian Blackwater didn't send men away. He erased them. Mia swallowed hard, her appetite evaporating, and whispered, "Is Mark alive?" But Elena didn't answer immediately, simply adjusting the blanket with unnecessary precision before finally saying, "Mr. Blackwater knows what he's doing," which wasn't an answer, not really, and Mia's stomach tightened. After Elena left, Mia forced herself to eat, despite the tension swirling in her chest, because she needed strength, needed clarity, needed something stable in a world that kept shifting under her feet. Hours later, when she was finally allowed to stand, she walked slowly down the hallway, her steps tentative, her mind heavy, until she reached the main staircase where she heard voices, low, tense. "Ale," and her heart froze when she recognized Adrian's voice, sharper than usual, edged with something dangerous. She moved closer, staying hidden behind a marble column as Adrian stood in the foyer facing his lieutenant, the same one from earlier, who now looked even paler. "The men are secured," the lieutenant reported, "all 15. But Adrian didn't react, only asked quietly, "And the other matter?" And the lieutenant hesitated before replying, "Sir, we found something else," handing Adrian a PIQ. Hone, Mark's phone, and Adrian scrolled through it slowly, his expression darkening with every swipe, his jaw clenching harder and harder, until Mia could practically feel the anger rolling off him in cold waves. Adrian finally whispered, "He recorded it." And Mia felt her knees weaken because she knew exactly what he meant. The night of her injury, the twisting of her arm, the way she collapsed, begging him to stop, her humiliation preserved in digital cruelty. Adrian's voice dropped even lower, a tone that made the lieutenant tense like a soldier at attention. "Destroy every copy," he ordered, "and find out who he sent it to." Mia gasped softly, unable to stay hidden, and Adrian turned instantly, eyes locking on her with a force that made her breath hitch. He stepped toward her, his movements controlled but infused with something fierce, and he said, "You shouldn't be walking around," his gaze sweeping over her bandaged arm, her pale face, the way she leaned slightly against the wall, and she whispered, "I'm fine." But he shook his head slowly, stepping closer until she could feel his breath on her skin as he murmured, "You are not fine, and you don't have to pretend for me." No one had ever said that to her. No one had ever given her permission to not be strong, and her eyes stung immediately. Adrian noticed his expression shifting from fury to something she didn't understand, something softer, scarier, deeper. And he lifted a hand as if to touch her cheek, but stopped inches away, fingers trembling faintly before he pulled back, whispering, "I won't hurt you." And something in his voice cracked just a little, as though the idea of hurting her was unbearable even to imagine. Mia swallowed, forcing air into her lungs, and whispered, "What will you do with them?" But Adrian didn't answer, instead taking her hand, the uninjured one, and guiding her gently down the stairs as he said, "Come, there's something you need to see." And though fear flickered in her chest, she followed her. Because despite everything he was, everything he had done, everything he could do, he had never lied to her, never threatened her, never touched her with anything but caution. And as he led her toward the eastern courtyard, her heart pounded with dread and curiosity, because whatever waited for her outside would change everything she thought she knew about Adrian, about his world, about the violence she had survived, and about the kind of man who would erase 15 men before sunrise for a Mai. Jait, who still flinched when someone raised their voice. Mia followed Adrian through the long glass corridor, her bare feet whispering against the polished floor, while his steps remained silent, predatory, carrying the weight of decisions no ordinary man should ever have to make. And the closer they got to the eastern courtyard, the colder the air became, not because of the morning breeze, but because of the tension curling in the walls themselves, as though the mansion knew violence had passed through. It in the night. When Adrian pushed open the door, sunlight spilled over the courtyard, wide stone tiles, manicured hedges, a fountain in the center. But Mia's breath caught when she saw the men kneeling in a line near the far wall, 15 of them, heads bowed, hands tied behind their backs, guarded by 6 of Adrian's enforcers, who stood like statues carved from steel and shadow, and for a brief moment Mia couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't even think, because the scene in front of her felt unreal, like something ripped from the stories whispered about Adrian Blackwater but never confirmed. And yet here it was, unmistakable, undeniable, terrifying in its calm. Adrian stepped forward, his hand leaving hers only when she stopped walking, frozen by fear, and he turned to her with eyes that no longer held softness but something colder, something ancient, something built from decades of survival and legacy, and he whispered, "You don't have to watch." But Mia shook her head weakly. "Una." Prell to explain that she needed to understand the world she had stepped into, needed to see who he truly was, before she could decide whether to fear him or trust him. Adrian nodded once, then turned toward his men, his entire posture shifting from human to legend in a single blink, and in a voice that carried effortlessly across the stone he said, "You all know why you're here." And some of the kneeling men flinched, some trembled, some stared at the ground with hollow eyes as he continued, "You two." Shah shared what when his gaze flicked briefly toward her, the message clear. This is not about punishment. This is about protection. And she whispered, "Adrian." But her voice dissolved into the morning air. He stepped closer to Mark, who was kneeling at the front, his face bruised, lips split, eyes dull with fear and humiliation, and when Mark finally dared to key, "Oh, look up at Adrian." His voice cracked as he whispered, "I'm sorry." But Adrian's expression didn't change, didn't soften, because apologies meant nothing to a man who lived by actions, not words. Adrian crouched slightly, bringing himself eye-level with Mark, and said in a low, calm tone that made Mia's skin prickle, "You didn't just break her arm, you recorded it." And Mark's face drained of color instantly, because he hadn't realized Adrian already knew, hadn't expected that his cowardice, his cruelty, his disgusting attempt at humiliation had already been exposed. Adrian continued, "You shared it." And Mark stuttered, I didn't send it to anyone outside the staff." But Adrian tilted his head with that slow, frightening curiosity predators show before striking and said, "You sent it to 7 men." Lifting Mark's phone as evidence, the screen still showing the list of recipients, and Mark's voice died in his throat. Adrian straightened, his shadow falling over all 15 men as he spoke. You think you can shame someone under my protection? You think you can break her bones, mock her pain, and turn it into entertainment?" And the courtyard fell so silent, Mia could hear her own heartbeat, loud, uneven, terrified, but also something else, something like awe, because she had never seen anyone fight for her, not like this, not with this level of devotion and fury. Adrian stepped back, raising a hand, and the 6 enforcers stiffened, ready for whatever order would come. But instead of command, Adrian turned to Mia slowly, his expression shifting again, softening only for her as though he were capable of 2 different identities. One the mafia heir feared across every corner of Melbourne's underworld, and one the man who watched her with silent questions in his eyes. He approached her with steps careful enough to counter the brutality she had just witnessed, and when he reached her, he spoke in a low voice only she could hear, saying, "Tell me what you want," and the words hit her so hard, her knees nearly buckled because no man had ever asked what she wanted. No one had ever given her the choice, the power, the voice. She blinked rapidly, looking from Adrian to the men, then back at Adrian and whispered, I don't want anyone dead," her voice trembling, but steady in conviction. And Adrian's jaw clenched once as though restraining a different instinct. Before he nodded slowly, he turned toward his men again and declared, "They live," and a collective breath escaped the courtyard. But then he added, "But not here, and we." With a single gesture, he sealed their fate. The men were dragged away, not killed, but banished permanently from Adrian's empire, stripped of protection, of work, of reputation, of safety, left to fend for themselves in a world where losing Adrian Blackwater's favor was often more dangerous than death. Mia watched in silence, a wave of relief mixed with fear washing over her as Adrian returned to her side, his voice gentler than she had expected when he said, "You showed mercy," his eyes scanning her face as though seeing her for the first time. "Even after everything they did to you?" And she whispered, "Someone has to." But Adrian shook his head, stepping close enough for his voice to melt into her skin as he murmured, "Mercy doesn't exist in my world, but maybe it exists in you." And for the first time since arriving in this mansion, Mia realized she wasn't just a maid anymore. She was becoming something far more dangerous, far more powerful, the only softness in a man built entirely from shadows and the only person he would destroy the world to protect. The courtyard emptied slowly, the echo of dragged footsteps fading into the morning as Mia stood frozen in place, clutching her injured arm while Adrian remained beside her, silent, unreadable, the hard lines of his jaw still tense with the remnants of violence he had barely kept contained. But when he finally turned to her, something in his expression shifted. A softness buried beneath layers of ruthlessness, a softness meant only for her, and Mia felt her breath catch as he said quietly, "You shouldn't be out in the cold," then gently touched her elbow to guide her inside, the gesture so careful, so deliberate, it made her chest tighten with an emotion she didn't want to name. They walked through the grand halls in silence, sunlight spilling across polished marble, chandeliers scattering fractured light over Adrian's dark suit, making him look both unreal and devastatingly present. And Mia wondered how she ever feared Amar. Who could be this gentle with her while remaining so terrifying with the rest of the world? When they reached the private lounge near his office, Adrian opened the door and gestured for her to enter first, an unexpected courtesy that made her hesitate, but his eyes flicked to her bandaged arm and he murmured, "Please," and Mia stepped inside, sinking into the plush sofa as he closed the door behind them, sealing them in a room thick with unspoken truths. Adrian stood at the bar counter, pouring himself a drink, hands steady but eyes stormy, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low with restrained fury. "Mia, you didn't tell me the whole truth about what happened." And her pulse spiked because she knew exactly what he meant. The bruises on her ribs, the older marks, the ones she had prayed he wouldn't notice. But of course he did. Adrian Blackwater noticed everything. She looked away, staring at her hands as she whispered, "It wasn't all from last night." And Adrian turned sharply, face hitting the counter with a muted thud, his nostrils flaring with a rage that wasn't directed at her, but at whatever ghost she still carried. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and knelt in front of her, an impossible sight. Melbourne's most feared mafia heir kneeling before a maid, taking her wrist with the lightest touch as he murmured, "Who hurt you before this?" But she pulled her hand back instantly, whispering, "It doesn't matter." Yet Adrian shook his head, leaning closer until she could feel his breath on her skin, his voice a low growl when he said, "Everything that touches you matters to me now," and the words were so raw, so unexpected. Mia froze, unsure whether to run or collapse into him. She whispered, "You shouldn't say things like that." But Adrian tilted his head, studying her like she was a puzzle he was slowly learning to understand, and said, "I don't say anything I don't mean." And the confession sent a shiver through her so strong she had to grip the sofa to steady herself. Before she could respond, a knock sounded at the door, breaking the moment like shattered glass, and Adrian's entire demeanor changed, his warmth disappearing instantly as he rose to his full height, becoming the cold, commanding figure everyone else knew. "Enter," he called, and his right-hand man stepped inside, holding a small folder with a tense expression. "We found something else," the man said, handing the folder to Adrian, who opened it with a single flick of his fingers, his eyes scanning the documents inside, growing darker with every passing second, until he finally closed it with a snap that made Mia flinch. Adrian dismissed the man with a subtle nod, then turned back to Mia with an expression she had never seen on him before. Fear, not for himself, but for her. He sat beside her slowly, the cushion dipping under his weight, and handed her the folder with surprising hesitation, as though the contents might hurt her more than any broken bone. Mia opened it carefully and felt the world tilt beneath her. Inside were photos not from last night, but from months ago when she still worked at the hotel before coming to the mansion. Photos she never knew were taken. Photos of her hiding bruises behind long sleeves. Photos of her limping after a shift. Photos of her crying in the alley behind the building. And Mia felt tears burn her eyes as she whispered, "How did you get these?" But Adrian's voice was barely controlled when he replied, "These were on Mark's phone, too." Oh, and Mia's entire body went cold, because that meant Mark had known she was vulnerable long before he ever touched her, that he had watched her, tracked her, maybe even followed her, and the thought made bile rise in her throat. Adrian took the photos gently from her trembling hands and set them aside before taking her chin between his fingers, forcing her to look at him as he whispered, "Tell me who did this to you." And Mia's voice cracked as she whispered, "My stepfather," the words tasting like old fear and broken memories. Adrian closed his eyes for a brief moment, a tremor running through his jaw, and when he opened them again, there was a darkness in his gaze she hadn't seen even in the courtyard, a darkness deeper than anger, something cold, something lethal, something personal. "Where is he now?" Adrian asked, and Mia shook her head, whispering, "I don't know. I left home months ago. I don't even know if he cares that I'm gone." But Adrian leaned closer, his voice trembling not with rage but with something frighteningly protective as he said, "I care." And Mia's breath hitched because the words sounded like a vow, like a promise forged in the bones of the earth itself. Before Mia could respond, Adrian reached out, gently wiping the tears off her cheek with the back of his knuckles, an unexpected tenderness that made her heart ache, and he whispered, "I will not let anyone hurt you again." And the quiet certainty in his tone made Mia realize something terrifying. Adrian Bull. Sackwater was more dangerous in his gentleness than in his violence, because when he cared with the full force of a man who had never known limits. Mia whispered, "Adrian, why are you doing this?" And he stared at her for a long, breathless moment before saying in a voice soft enough to break her heart, "Because the moment I saw you hiding your pain, I couldn't look away." And Mia felt something inside her shift, something she didn't understand yet, something that both terrified and comforted her. But before she could speak, Adrian rose slowly and extended his hand to her, saying, "Come with me." His voice a blend of command and plea. And she took his hand because despite everything she feared, everything she didn't know, everything she couldn't explain, she trusted him, trusted the only man who had ever fought for her without asking for anything in return. And as he led her deeper into the mansion, Mia realized with a faint, trembling breath that her life had already changed for her, and there was no path back to who she used to be. Adrian led Mia through a dim hallway she had never entered before, the air colder, cleaner, carrying the faint scent of cedar and gun oil, the kind of smell that didn't belong in a mansion, but in a world built on blood oaths and silent wars. And Mia's pulse quickened as she realized where they were going. The restricted wing, the one staff whispered about but never dared approach, and when Adrian unlocked the heavy door at the end, she expected no vault of weapons, a room of secrets, something frightening. But instead she stepped into a private gallery filled with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the entire eastern side of Melbourne, the skyline rising like steel teeth against the sky, the Yarra River glistening in the distance, and she inhaled sharply because the room wasn't meant for business or violence, it was meant for solitude. Adrian walked toward the largest window, hands clasped behind his back, shoulders tense, and Mia stood near the door, unsure whether she was supposed to follow, until he turned slightly and said, "Come," his voice softer than his posture suggested, so she approached slowly, feeling the warmth of sunlight grazing her skin, and when she stood beside him, Adrian nodded toward the cityscape and murmured, "I built all of this from the moment I was old enough to walk." And Mia blinked in surprise because she had never heard him speak about himself, not even once. Adrian continued, his voice low and distant. "Tess, my father ran the family with iron fists. No mercy, no hesitation. He believed fear was the only language men understood." And Mia swallowed, realizing how much of Adrian's brutality had been shaped long before she arrived. He glanced at her, expression unreadable, before adding, "I promised myself I'd never become him," and the confession stunned her, because the world whispered Adrian Blackwater was merciless, unstoppable, a monster carved from the shadows of Melbourne's underworld, yet he was admitting he feared becoming something worse. Mia whispered, "You're not like him," but Adrian let out a breath that sounded almost like a bitter laugh as he replied, "You don't know what I've done." And Mia reached out instinctively, placing her good hand on his forearm, surprising both of them as she whispered, "I know what you did for me." And Adrian stilled, his muscles tightening beneath her touch, as though no one had ever touched him gently before. He turned toward her, eyes locked onto hers with a depth that made her chest ache, and he said, "Mia, when I saw you hiding that fracture, when I saw the fear in your eyes, something inside me snapped." Stepping closer, lowering his voice to a trembling confession, "I don't break for anyone, but I broke for you." And Mia felt her throat close because no one in her entire life had ever broken for her, fought for her, protected her. She whispered, "Adrian, I don't understand." But he stepped even closer, so near she could feel the heat of his body warming the cold air around her, and he murmured, "You don't have to understand, just know I will never let anyone touch you again." And the gentleness in his tone was more powerful than any threat she had ever heard. Before Mia could respond, a sudden chime echoed through the room. Adrian's private phone, the one only his closest circle could call, and his expression hardened instantly as he stepped back, the softness replaced by lethal focus. He answered without greeting, "Wale." Listening intently, and Mia watched the muscles in his jaw clench one by one, as the voice on the other end spoke urgently, until Adrian finally said, "How long?" in a tone that made her chest tighten. He hung up slowly, turning back to her with eyes darker than storm clouds, and Mia whispered, "What happened?" But Adrian didn't answer immediately, as though weighing how much truth she could handle, before he finally said, "Your stepfather, he's not missing. He's here." And Mia's blood ran cold as Ian added, "He's in Melbourne," his voice vibrating with fury, "and he's looking for you." And Mia stumbled back, gripping the edge of a table, as a wave of terror crashed through her, memories flooding her vision. Shattered plates, broken ribs, fists slamming into walls beside her head, his drunken voice slurring threats. And she whispered, No. No, he can't be. But Adrian stepped forward and caught her trembling shoulders, steadying her with hands large enough to break bones, yet gentle enough to hold her like she was made of fragile crystal, and he whispered, "Mia, look at me," lifting her chin as tears welled in her eyes. "You're not alone, not anymore." But Mia shook her head, voice shaking as she whispered, "You don't know what he's capable of." And Adrian's expression darkened with a cruelty that wasn't aimed at her, but at the man who had haunted her life, as he leaned closer and murmured, "I have ended men far more dangerous than him," the words rolling off his tongue like a vow carved in stone. "He will not touch you, not while I breathe." Mia felt torn between fear and relief, between past terror and present protection, but before she could speak, Adrian's lieutenant burst through the door, breathless, eyes wide, and said, "Boss, you need to see this," handing him a tablet. Adrian glanced at the screen, his face draining of color in a way Mia had never seen before. And when she leaned to look, she saw it too. Security footage from the front gate, her stepfather standing outside. The estate, pacing like a predator with rage in his eyes, screaming her name loud enough to rattle the intercom. Mia's knees buckled, her breath shattering, but Adrian caught her immediately, pulling her against his chest with a force that felt like a shield forming around her body. And in a voice so cold it chilled the air, he whispered, "Get her to the panic suite." Then looked at his lieutenant and added, "And bring him inside, alive," the final word dripping with a promise of a reckoning that would shake the entire Blackwater territory to its core. Mia grabbed his sleeve, desperate, terrified, whispering, "Adrian, don't, he'll hurt you." But Adrian cupped her face, pressing his forehead to hers with a tenderness that made her heart ache, and whispered, "He won't get the chance," before turning away with the lethal purpose of a man ready to burn the city down for her. The moment Adrian turned away from her, Mia felt the world tilt again, the air thinning around her as two guards approached her. Escort her toward the inner corridors, but she clung to Adrian's sleeve one last time, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Please don't leave me alone." And something in her tone, raw, terrified, familiar, made Adrian freeze mid-step before he gently pried her fingers loose, lowering his head so their eyes aligned, and murmured, "I'm not leaving you. I'm securing the world around you," the certainty in his voice vibrating through her bones. And then he gently pressed a kiss to her forehead. So key. She almost thought she imagined it, before handing her to his guards and striding down the hall, with the lethal determination of a man who had already decided someone would not leave the mansion alive. Mia was rushed through 2 locked doors, down a staircase she never knew existed, into a hidden corridor carved beneath the estate, the lights dim and humming, the walls thick enough to muffle explosions, until the guards opened a reinforced steel door, revealing a small panic suite lined with screens, cameras, emergency supplies, and a couch too soft for her shaking body, and she whispered, "I don't belong here," but the guard replied, "You do now," closing the door behind her, leaving Mia alone with her pounding heart and the image of her stepfather screaming at the gate. She stared at the screens which displayed every angle of the mansion, and one of them flickered to show Adrian walking across the marble foyer, shoulders broad, expression carved from stone, flanked by 2 lieutenants. As they approached the entrance, where her stepfather now stood surrounded by 3 men holding him still, and even through the cameras Mia could see the hatred in his eyes, the hatred that had followed her since childhood, the hatred that shaped every bruise she hid, the hatred that made her run away from home and pray she never saw him again. Adrian stepped forward, and her stepfather spat on the ground and growled, "Where's my daughter?" But Adrian didn't flinch, didn't blink, simply adjusted his cuffs with slow, deliberate precision as he said, "You'll address me with respect inside my house." And Mia's breath caught, because Adrian didn't use threats. He used presence, the kind that crushed entire rooms without raising his voice. Her stepfather snarled, "She's mine! You think you can keep her from me?" And Adrian tilted his head slightly, an eerie calm settling over him as he said, "She was never yours," the words precise, Cutting, true. Her stepfather lunged forward, but Adrian's men forced him down, shoving him to his knees, and Adrian crouched in front of him, staring into his eyes with the kind of cold interest a predator gives a dying animal, and said, "You hurt her for years, didn't you?" And Mia watched her stepfather smirk, the same cruel smirk she had seen 1,000 times growing up, as he replied, "She deserved every bit of it. She was weak, useless, good for nothing." And Mia covered her mouth with both hands to stop the sob ripping through her chest, tears flooding. Her eyes, as every old wound, reopened inside her. Adrian didn't move at first, didn't react, but Mia knew what happened when Adrian went silent. His fury calcified, sharpened into something surgical. So when he finally spoke, his voice was death itself. "You're going to regret those words." And then Adrian stood, nodding for his men to drag the monster inside. Mia watched helplessly as they hauled her stepfather into a soundproof interrogation chamber, a room she had only heard whispers about, Adrian. Stripping off his suit jacket and rolling up his sleeves, his tattoos visible for the first time, snaking up his forearms like black waves of violence and legacy carved into skin. He entered the chamber, the door sealing behind him, and Mia gripped the edges of the screen as the feed switched to the interior camera. Adrian circled her stepfather slowly, like a storm stalking its target, and Mia whispered, "Adrian, please don't," even though he couldn't hear her, but something in her heart already knew it was too late. Adrian spoke first, his voice smooth, terrifyingly calm. "You broke a child," and her stepfather sneered, "And I'll break her again." And Adrian struck him, not with rage but with precision, one hit to the jaw that snapped his head sideways, blood spraying onto the floor, and her stepfather laughed through the pain. "You think she's worth anything?" And Adrian hit him again, harder, a strike that echoed even through the soundproof walls of the suite, and Mia curled into her seat. Still trembling, torn between horror and the overwhelming, disorienting feeling of being protected for the first time in her life, Adrian grabbed her stepfather by the collar and hissed, "She's worth more than your entire miserable existence," slamming him against the wall, the impact rattling the camera. And her stepfather groaned, "You love her or something?" Mocking, taunting, but Adrian didn't deny it, didn't flinch, didn't look away. Instead, he tightened his grip and whispered with a darkness that made the hair on Mia's arms stand up, "I don't need to love her to destroy you, but I will," his voice a quiet promise of ruin. Her stepfather spit blood, wheezing out, "She's weak, just like her mother." And Adrian's face twisted with a fury Mia had never seen before. Not anger, not hatred, but something deeper, personal, primal. And he slammed her stepfather onto the table, pinning him down with one hand while murmuring, "She's stronger than you ever deserved." And then he turned away slightly, breathing hard, forcing himself to regain control because Adrian didn't lose control. Not for business, not for war, not for anyone, but for Mia. He was close, dangerously close, and Mia pressed her palm to the screen, whispering, "Stop, please," tears streaming down her face, because she didn't want Adrian to become a monster for her sake. The camera flickered as Adrian stepped back, fists clenched, chest rising and falling with restrained violence, and he said to his men outside the chamber, "Take H. him to the holding cells, I'm not done with him." And Mia exhaled a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding as the guards dragged her stepfather out, broken but alive. Adrian stayed behind in the empty room, hands braced on the table, head bowed, breathing hard as though fighting a war inside himself. And Mia watched him whisper something she couldn't hear, a confession or a curse or her name she didn't know, before he finally left the chamber. Mia collapsed onto the couch, sobbing with relief. And terror and gratitude tangled into one unbearable knot, and she whispered into the silence of the panic suite, "Adrian, what are you becoming because of me?" Unaware that upstairs, Adrian was asking himself the exact same question, but with a far more dangerous answer. When the guards finally unlocked the panic suite hours later, Mia rose on unsteady legs, her heart still hammering from everything she had witnessed, but the moment the door opened, she saw Adrian standing there alone. No guards, no lieutenants, no mask of power. Just him, shoulders slightly slumped, tie loosened, eyes dark with exhaustion and something far heavier, and he stepped forward silently, as though every step he took toward her was an admission, a surrender, a confession carved into the floor. Mia felt tears sting her eyes as she whispered, "Adrian." But before she could say anything else, he closed the distance and pulled her into his arms, not carefully this time, not cautiously, but with a desperation he could nigh. O longer hide, his hand cradling the back of her head as he exhaled into her hair like he had been holding his breath for hours, and Mia melted against him, burying her face in his chest, her body trembling as he murmured, "I'm here. You're safe. No one will ever touch you again." His voice raw, frayed, the voice of a man who had crossed lines for her and would cross 100 more if she asked. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in each other in the dim hallway beneath the mansion to woe-broken histories colliding in the only way they knew how, silently, painfully, truthfully, until Mia finally pulled back enough to look into his eyes, whispering, "What now?" And Adrian cupped her face, thumbs brushing her cheeks as he whispered, "Now you stop running." And Mia's breath caught as he added, "Now you heal." The words gentle but coated in steel, because he wasn't asking, he was promising. Adrian led her upstairs slowly, making sure not to rush her, guiding her through the halls until they reached his private wing, where he stopped at a door she had never seen open before. He unlocked it and pushed it open, revealing a bedroom unlike anything in the rest of the mansion, soft lights, warm colors, a balcony overlooking the glittering Melbourne skyline, a room made not for power but for peace, and Mia froze because she understood instantly. This wasn't his room. This was a room he had never let anyone into, a room he had kept untouched, unused, waiting without reason. Until now. Adrian turned to her, hesitating for the first time since she had met him, and said quietly, "Stay here. Not because you're scared, but because you deserve a room where no one has ever raised a hand at you." And Mia's throat tightened with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude, so overwhelming she had to lean against the doorframe to stay upright. He stepped closer, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear with a gentleness that contradicted everything the world believed about him, and whispered, "You'll handle the rest." But Mia grabbed his wrist quickly, shaking her head as her voice cracked, "Don't become someone you'll regret because of me." And Adrian's expression softened into something almost painful as he whispered, "Mia, I became someone I hated long before you came. If anything, you're the only thing pulling me back." And Mia felt tears spill down her cheeks as his hand slid down to rest lightly against her jaw, tracing the outline of her face like she was something he wasn't sure he deserved to touch. Before either of them could speak again, Adrian's lieutenant rushed down the hall, stopping abruptly when he saw how close they were. But Adrian didn't step back. He narrowed his eyes in a silent warning before the man swallowed hard and said, "Boss, he's awake," meaning her stepfather. Mia stiffened, but Adrian gave her a reassuring nod before turning to leave, and she whispered after him, "Adrian, please, just don't kill him." And he paused mid-step, shoulders tight, jaw clench, before turning to look at her with an expression carved from conflict and restraint, and he whispered, "For you, I won't." Then disappeared down the corridor with the speed of a man ready to end a war. Mia waited in the bedroom, pacing, trembling, praying, until the intercom crackled and Elena's voice told her softly, "Come downstairs when you're ready." The tone strange, gentle, almost proud. When Mia walked into the foyer, her heart stopped. Her stepfather was there, restrained, bruised, Terry. Fied in a way she had never seen, and Adrian stood in front of him, hands clasped behind his back, face unreadable, eyes colder than winter rain over Melbourne. Adrian said quietly, "You have two choices," his voice like a judge delivering a sentence. You leave Victoria today and never return, or I will ensure you cannot return. And the implication hung heavy in the air. Her stepfather spat out, "You don't scare me." But Adrian stepped forward, leaned in close enough for Mia to see her stepfather. Gar's body flinch and whispered something in his ear that made the color drain completely from the man's face. Whatever Adrian said wasn't loud, but it was lethal, personal, the kind of truth only a man like Adrian Blackwater could deliver. Her stepfather nodded frantically, fear dripping off him like sweat, and Adrian signaled his men, who dragged him out through the front door and threw him into a waiting car that sped away, disappearing beyond the black iron gates. The moment the car vanished, Adrian exhaled slowly, his shoulders finally lowering as if releasing years of tension, and Mia stepped closer, whispering, "What did you tell him?" And Adrian looked at her with eyes that held storm and softness at once, murmuring, "Enough to keep him from ever looking for you again." And Mia believed him entirely. For the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid, not of her stepfather, not of tomorrow, not of the world, because standing in front of her was a man who had become her shield, her fur, her storm, her impossible salvation. Mia took a trembling step toward him, then another, until she stood close enough to feel his breath brush her lips as she whispered, "Thank you." And Adrian's hand lifted as though drawn by instinct, resting lightly on her cheek as he whispered, "Don't thank me. You deserved this freedom long before I came." And the emotion rising in his voice made Mia's heart crack open in a way she never expected. The mansion fell silent around them, sunlight pouring through the high windows, dust turning to glitter in the warm Australian light, as Adrian leaned his forehead against hers, both of them breathing in the same fragile peace that neither had ever known before. And in that stillness, Mia realized something she never thought possible. She wasn't just protected. She was seen, valued, wanted, and for the first time since childhood, she felt safe. Adrian whispered her name like a confession, "Mia," and she closed her eyes, letting herself fall into the gravity of him, both of them suspended between the past they escaped and the future neither had dared to dream. And though neither spoke it aloud, the truth settled around them with quiet certainty. 15 men were gone, her abuser banished, her nightmares breaking apart one by one, and Adrian Blackwater, the most feared mafia heir in Melbourne, had done it all for her.